Well, I think we'll make a start. So, good afternoon, everyone, to our Friday forum. Our speaker this afternoon does not need any extended introduction from me, so I'm going to keep it very brief. So it is an absolute honour to welcome Sir James MacMillan to our Friday forum. James is, without question, the preeminent Scottish composer of his generation. He first attracted attention in the early 1990s with the Confession of Isabel Gaudi and his percussion concerto Veni Veni Emmanuel. Many major works followed, including the cantata Seven Last Words from the Cross, the operas Innis de Castro and The Sacrifice, St. John Passion, St. Luke Passion, and so far, 5 symphonies. Recent highlights include his Stabat Mater for the 16, which was streamed from the Sistine Chapel, and the anthem Who Shall Separate Us, commissioned for the funeral of Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II in 2022. So without further ado, I will now pass on to my colleague, Richard McGregor, who will be chairing this session. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Nick. James, when we were doing our starting up, we had a discussion before. Some of the things that we heard about your connection with Max go right back to perhaps your earlier school days. Can you just give us an idea about what this particular one about the 8 songs?
Well, I was excited very, very early on in my life that there was such a thing as a living composer, that composers were not just dead people that lived hundreds of years ago, but there were people alive today. And when I started music, it was the late 1960s. I was about 8 or 9. I knew right from day one I wanted to be a composer, and I was very excited by the fact that the one that stuck out in my mind lived a couple of 100 miles down the road in England. His name is Benjamin Britten. I never met Britten, but I very quickly realised there were others closer to home by that stage, the early 70s, and that one major, quite sort of noteworthy figure had moved to Scotland and set up home and indeed his festival in the Orkney Islands. And I get fascinated by this. And then I noticed, and this I would have been probably a 4th or 5th year student, 4th or 5th form student at Cumnock Academy in Ayrshire, round about the mid-70s, 76 maybe, when the BBC showed on television 8 Songs for a Mad King. I don't know in what context it was, but I was, anything by a composer, living or dead, was something I would watch. And the BBC had a commitment to composers, living and dead, back then, in a way that BBC television doesn't have, as we know today. So I watched this on the television and was astonished by it. It was a theatrical performance, and for any music lover, someone interested in music, it's an astonishing experience. And this was the days before video or easily accessible video. There was no way of recording it. So what I did was I stuck my cassette tape recorder in front of the television and recorded it. A very bad quality sound, but I got all of it on a tape, one of these old cassette tapes, which nobody has anymore, of course. And we had a class at school, which was a kind of show and tell sort of thing. We just brought along recordings of things that we loved and was interested in, and we played it to other members of the class, students, and we're talking about 15, 16, 17-year-olds and music teachers. And it was mostly a mixture of classical and pop music and jazz and things, but I took along this to the class. And okay, it was a very, very duff recording, but it completely astonished people, my friends and teachers, that this was this had been broadcast, and I was taken by it. And we all thought it was very funny as well. And as teenagers, we were used to watching Monty Python from week to week. It was part of that world as well, I suppose. But it lived with me in a quite an important and impactful way, and it certainly established in my at quite an early age that Maxwell was an important figure in the world of contemporary. Hello,
Nick,
you, you all froze there for a minute, but I think you're back. Yeah.
Yeah. So that led to you going to the St. Magnus Festival. Is that yeah? Can you tell us about that? Because these were early days of the Magnus Festival. 1977 was the first one, I think. But you were there fairly early on. And
yes, I went up to the 1980 St. Magnus Festival. I was an undergraduate at Edinburgh University then, and I had actually met Max in Edinburgh probably the previous year through an organisation called ECAT, the Edinburgh Contemporary Arts Trust, which had been set up by composers Peter Nelson and Geoffrey King. And they did a kind of retrospective of Max's work, chamber music, at Edinburgh University, which was an astonishing experience for me. And Max came to it. And I remember the ECAT ensemble being conducted by Geoffrey King. And one of the works that stood out for me was his Missa l'Homme Armé, partly because Geoffrey was dressed up as the Pope to conduct this piece. So it was all done very theatrically. And I met Max. I said I wanted to send him some of my music, which I did. And I got a reply, which was astonishing. And there was no emails in those days, it was handwritten letters. And I decided to go to the 1980 festival with a friend from Edinburgh University. We went up to Orkney from Edinburgh with a 2-man tent, and we stayed in the rather Spartan and basic camping ground at Kirkwall. And we got the tent was terrible, actually. It let in a lot of rain. And I woke up one morning in a puddle, but it just shows you how committed I was to the cause, as it were, and finding out more and more about Maxwell Davies. Went to as many concerts as I could afford, one of which was the world premiere. Well, there was two things. The world premiere of his Yellow Cake Review, which of course includes Farewell to Stromness, I think I'm right in saying. And Max played that himself on a little upright piano. And so that was an astonishing event, and in many ways quite historic in a musicological way. I also attended the first performance of Cinderella, his children's opera, which he wrote for. Well, it certainly involved a lot of youngsters from Kirkwall Grammar School and perhaps Stromness Academy as well. And that was astonishing as well. You know, the mixing of amateurs and professionals, young people and professionals, and carrying on the Benjamin Britten line of writing really substantial, important works for young people to perform. And unknown to me, things were germinating in my subconscious about things that I would do many, many years later. And the whole experience of seeing Max in Kirkwall, in Stromness, going along to concerts at Stromness Village Hall, and sitting next to George Mackay Brown and getting into a conversation with him about Catholicism and God knows what else. It was just absolutely sort of character forming, character building, and it had a huge impact on the way that I thought about contemporary music. And as I say, it was to grow and expand in my own thinking about festivals and the relationship of composers to our societies and how useful you can be. And Max carried on that idea that a composer should be useful to his community, that you could find in earlier British composers like Benjamin Britten, but also Michael Tippett and Gustav Holst and many, many others. And so these were things were germinating in my own mind, and I was deeply impressed by what I saw in Orkney in 1980. So that was my first visit to the St. Magnus Festival.
And you said that Max gave 2 lectures there. Yeah.
Yes, I mean he was astonishingly energetic. You know, he'd be conducting the Fires of London one night, and there'd be visiting orchestras, and then he gave these prepared lectures as well, and they were quite clearly scripted, and a lot of input and academic research had gone into it, in a way that later on that there wasn't as much evidence as that. He would talk off the cuff a lot more in later life, but then these were two clearly meticulously prepared lectures. One was on Beethoven, the Beethoven sonatas, the late Beethoven piano sonatas. And then I think the next day there was a lecture on Gregorian chant, two very different branches of music, but two forms of music that in many ways fascinated Max and had contributed to his own compositional journey. And I mean, Max loved Gregorian chant. I mean, in later years, when I visited him at his cottage in Hoy, he had a copy of the Liber Usualis on his desk, on his composing desk. This is this huge compendium of these chants that he would delve into, and we know that he was, he would reimagine or recontextualize, remodelize chants for his own benefit, for his own use in composition. Chant did mean a lot to him, and he was able to give a very scholarly, in-depth lecture on it, which touched on a whole range of things like the modern usage of Gregorian chant and what he thought of the monks of Salem and what they were doing, and what he thought of he was scathing about what he thought was that the way that the modern church had ditched a lot of it, had abandoned chant, which is something I certainly agreed with him on that. But it was a fascinating insight into this breadth of interest in music and other things.
Yeah, I mean, people will know that Max used plain chant, and sometimes it's obvious for whatever reason. Sometimes he'll use the plain chant because it's his birthday and it's the Virgin Mary's birthday too. But other times it's not so obvious why he would use a particular chant, and there's still a bit of work to be done, I think, in sort of identifying why some particular chants, some had symbolic, as I've said before, some I think probably had symbolic significance for him, maybe as talismans for starting composition off. But was your next sort of involvement when you got involved with the Strathclyde Concerto? There's between us, it might be about 87, would it?
Yes. I remember when Strathclyde Region, the old Strathclyde Region, commissioned Max. It was a very noteworthy thing. I remember it was on BBC television and so on the news, that Strathclyde Region had commissioned these 10 new works for Max to write for the principal players of the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. And I was actually at the launch of that. I was invited along to the reception, which was quite a lavish lunch, actually laid on by Strathclyde Regional Council. Lots of wine. It was wonderful. I remember immediately after the lunch, rather intoxicated, writing a letter of gratitude to the head of Strathclyde Regional Council, thanking him for his support for contemporary music. But Max was there, and there was a bit of a real media focus in getting it all started. But the curious thing to many people, but not perhaps to those who knew him and knew the motivation behind the likes of what Ian Ritchie and Catherine McDowell, of course, she was at the Scottish Chamber Orchestra back then too, as their education officer, was that connected with each of these concertos was quite a massive educational project in various different areas of Strathclyde. What Max and Ian and the SCO did was that they co-opted a younger composer, to be involved in leading the invention and the composition that would be taught and shared and explored in Strathclyde schools. And I was involved in the second one. I can't remember who did the first one. I think it might have been Bill Sweeney. The second concerto was a cello concerto, so that was the concerto that was written for William Conway, who was the cellist, principal cello of the SCO at the time. But it involved me going into schools in places like Irvine and Ayr and Kilwinning, is North Ayrshire mainly, and taking this idea of composition in the classroom and being an animateur, and that's something that was a very happening thing back then. It was being explored by the London Sinfonietta. It was being explored by Peter Weigold and so on, where they would, I mean, the composers weren't necessarily teachers, but they had a kind of teacherly instinct, and they became very useful allies to teachers of music in these schools, state schools in Scotland and in England, not just encouraging people to engage with contemporary music, but actually to write their own music. And a lot of the initial work was in the classroom was improvisation based, so that and this goes right back to what Max was doing in Cirencester, I believe. You know, he had a very radical, revolutionary way of teaching and encouraging young people to be interested in composition. That was a few decades earlier. And some of us ran with that, and Gillian Moore and Catherine McDowell saw ways of developing it in schools. And so I very early on became convinced that this was an important way of working. I'm still using some of the techniques today with the Cumnock Trist in some of the festival work we do in local schools in Ayrshire. But it did involve taking some basic techniques and parameters and technical ideas about structure, about form, about melody, monody, harmony, texture, and making games out of it, improvisational scenarios that the young people could be involved in immediately. So it was a different way of teaching composition, slightly less dry and academic and dusty, but very much hands-on, lots of improvisation that could lead to group improvisations. But also the real composers amongst these groups could take away a lot of the exciting ideas that emerged within the group and pursue their own development, their own ideas in their own individual ways. So it was a kind of win-win situation in many ways. It embraced so many different people into the scenario of making music from scratch, but it gave sparks of inspiration to the, as I say, the more serious or real composers amongst them that might want to follow the ideas in their own direction. And it was a very exciting time. So I did 8 weeks of that, going around the schools in Ayrshire. I wrote a piece, and that was the other thing. There wasn't just 10 concertos for Max to write. There was a new piece for each of the young composers to write for the Scottish Chamber Orchestra or members of them, and school groups within the area. The piece I wrote was a piece called Into the Ferment, which was written for the Ayrshire School Symphony Orchestra and a concertante group of 14, a kind of sinfonietta group from this SCO. And that piece is still played today. And I meet many of the players decades afterwards, who some of them have gone on into the profession. I was in Pittsburgh recently, and they're a new piece with the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra, and their principal flautist is from Largs, which is just down the road from me, and she played in the Ayrshire School Symphony Orchestra for that occasion. A brand new piece by myself. Who knows? That might have sparked her to pursue a life that's taken her to one of the great American orchestras. And there's others. Our lawyer in town here played viola in that first performance, and they all remember it. And there's lots of other music teachers that I come across that played in that first performance. We're absolutely intrigued with the fact that a piece of music was been written for them, but that they were meeting Maxwell Davies, a really major composer at the time, being seen on television with them. They could meet him in class, could ask him questions, and then they all came to the first performance of the new concerto, which was at the City Halls in Glasgow, given by the SCO and, as I say, William Conway. So it was a not just a revolutionary way of doing music, a very inclusive way, and a very ambitious way of spreading an educational input based on the creation of new music, with Maxwell Davies at the core of it.
Did he give you any, as it were, guidelines or principles or things that we wanted the composers to do with them?
Yes, very much so. All of us in the different projects had these meetings with Max where he talked to us about what techniques he was going to use, had used, or was likely to use in the forthcoming concerto. And I can't quite remember now what he focused on with me, but whatever he did, whatever he told me about the second concerto, I would make my notes and take them into the class. And some of them would be to do with magic squares or numbers, use of numbers, of course, but perhaps more accessible things like the imitation of a shoal of mackerel coming to the top of the water just off the coast of Hoy. And he saw that, and it was this incredible noise, all these fish waving their fins. And he tried to imitate that in the score. And that's obviously a very visual thing, which a lot of young people can relate to. And we took that idea into the class. What is it about something you've seen, something that has astonished you, that has a visual component, but perhaps also an oral component that you could try to imitate in a piece of music, that you could try to imitate in this class, this classroom improvisation that we were involved in there and then. So there were lots of things that fed back from what Max said about his music that we were able to take into the class, and then the youngsters would make their music based on some of these things, and then come along to the final performance, the first performance, and Max would tell them where to look out for these things that he had done similarly in the concerto.
So, I mean, that led to you then doing the composers' workshops, didn't it? Subsequently, on Hoy.
Yeah.
What was the? I mean, I think Sally also, when she was here, Sally Beamish also did them, and the notion of working with composers on Hoy had some interesting. The whole thing was kind of structured, but you obviously had your own way of doing things. Max wasn't telling you what to do exactly, but was there a kind of structure that you were working within? You know, did Max have a control over that, or were you just completely free to do what you wanted to do?
A bit of both. I mean, it was quite structured in that there were daily analysis sessions where I think it was a group of 8 composers. I did it twice, either very late in the 1980s or early in the 1990s. And we had a group of 8 each time. And so the 8 would meet with Max and myself, and he was quite meticulous and quite sort of rigorous in what he was asking us to do, to prepare analysis of, it could be a Haydn string quartet movement or something. So there were the things that the students had to prepare for. He also gave the students an opportunity to present their own work to the group, to show scores, share scores, play recordings if they had them. And then there were individual sessions involved. So both Max and myself were able to see the group see the students individually in the early days of the week. And then later in the week, because they were writing music all the time. I don't know where they found the time actually after all that, because these were quite lengthy sessions, analysis sessions, and then lessons and so on. But they had to find their own space in the little church or in the little rather Spartan accommodation block that they had to share, bunk beds and so on, and they had to begin the music that would be performed at the end of the week. Midway through the week, the Scottish Chamber Orchestra players arrived, and the dynamic changed. It was more to do with bringing semi-prepared work to the workshop, and that would be played through. So the students were able to experiment and hearing work being made, work that they had sketched perhaps, that could be performed and analysed and discussed with the players present, and that made the compositions grow and grow as the week went on, and it was all performed. There was 8 brand new pieces of, well, when I was there, it was certainly a string quartet. There might have been other ensembles in later years, and they would be performed to an audience, quite a large audience that came over from the Orkney mainland to hear the performances in the little church. It was really there was a lot of interest in it. There was even a BBC documentary made about one of the courses I was on, called The Road to Hoy, that was shown on BBC Two, different days.
One of the things that strikes you when you read some of the things that Max says, or reading some of his own personal comments, he struggled to begin with, I think, with some of the aspects of orchestration and instruments and players as well. And he over the years, I think he varied in his own confidence, in fact, about how successful or unsuccessful things were. When he was talking to the students, did he refer to his own experience at all?
Yes, he did. He was very empathetic in that way, in that he was able to help them through dry patches, if you like, and help open them up. And he would talk about his early experiences, and it was fascinating to hear him talk about his life as a young composer. And he had some quite difficult stories to tell about his student years in in Manchester and so on, and the way that his teachers or the lecturers there didn't understand him and didn't appreciate what he was doing. And that was a major change, though, between his generation and their generation, they were getting encouragement from the teachers, mainly, I think, at universities like York and Manchester and Glasgow and London and the colleges. But Max certainly had to fight in those early days, because the likes of Maxwell, Davies and Birtwistle in the 1950s in Manchester and so on would have probably been pushing against the grain a lot of the time.
What about subsequent to the composers courses? Did you have any connection with him, or did you work with him at all?
Well, I got to conduct a lot of his music. I started doing a lot of conducting. I never planned to be a conductor. It was as much as a surprise to me as anyone else when I started taking it seriously. I was well into my 30s when I did it, but you know, when I did some of the Strathclyde work, and then we took some of the Strathclyde work down to London, I was asked to conduct some of Max's chamber music in these scenarios, and that helped ignite in me an interest in conducting. I mean, I've always wanted to be involved. Maybe there's a certain type of person, type of musician, who likes organising his fellows into little ensembles as a student and so on. Certainly Max had that right from his early days, and you know, eventually Max was conducting very mixed programmes through the 80s and 90s with the SCO and all over the world. And that was an inspiration as well. I was able to observe that and possibly wonder to myself whether that would be something I would do. But eventually I started conducting some of Max's music, including his Fifth Symphony and some later music, some of the Strathclyde concertos, including the one that's a concerto for orchestra. Did that a few times. I've conducted the 2 string piece, so that's violin and viola and strings. It was one of the Strathclydes. And Max would come to those performances. And then after Max had this close relationship with the BBC Philharmonic Orchestra, he was their composer conductor in association for a while. And when he finished that, they let me take over from him. So I learned a lot from what Max did with them, carried on, and indeed carried on conducting some of Max's music into my own time with the BBC Phil. And that continued after me. H.K. Gruber took over from myself, and then Mark, the young clarinetist composer, took over as well. What's his name?
No.
Say that again?
Did you say, is it Simpson?
Mark Simpson, who's is a bit of a conductor, but he's also a fabulous player. So that tradition, if you like, started by Max, continued in different shapes and forms for the years to come.
I mean, Max did have initially a difficult relationship with the BBC Phil, particularly the brass players, I think it would be fair to say. But subsequently, I think that tension was largely resolved through his working with them as a conductor and the more experienced conductor that he'd become. Mm-hmm. Nick, it's maybe time for you because you wanted to have a
yes, thank you. James, it's interesting to hear you say that you conducted Max's Fifth Symphony. I wondered if I could ask you about the influence of Max's symphonies on your own symphonic output.
Well, I suppose the main influence was the fact that Max was committed to maintaining the idea of the symphony into the modern age. And, some people think it's an outdated historical form that may have outlived its purpose and usefulness and so on. But Max never really took that line. There was other composers as well that held the flame for the symphony. Tippett wrote 4, Schnittke wrote, was it 9 or 10? Henze, the same. And Max was one of those who, obviously the structures change and the aesthetic changes over the generations and the centuries, of course. What is a symphony? There's a PhD thesis in that, I suppose. And but there's something about the breadth and seriousness of statement, I think, whether it's a 10-minute symphony like one of Ustvolskaya's little things for five players and narrator, or Maxwell Davies's big substantial symphonies. There's something about the seriousness of purpose and seriousness of utterance, which I think can still demand the title symphony. And I think I got that from Maxwell Davies, that some pieces were symphonies and some pieces were not. And obviously, Max had one eye, or certainly one ear, on tradition. And you can feel the shaping of tradition, earlier symphonies, earlier symphonic composers, whether it be Mahler or Brahms or Haydn even. These figures were important for him, Sibelius. And you can feel some kind of echo of all those trends through history. So in some ways, Max was a traditionalist in that sense, in keeping alive a flame, and the flame was the idea of the symphony. He himself had been encouraged by earlier figures.
You're interesting you should say that, because I've just been looking at something, and he apparently walked around with a score of Sibelius 4 in his pocket for some time, because that meant that particular symphony meant quite a lot to him. We're not quite sure why or in what sense, but certainly it's one of Sibelius's more intense, I think. Nick.
The other thing I'm eager to ask you, James, is I can sense a lot of connections between your own kind of compositional interests and in connection with Max's own. You've already touched upon a couple of things. Max as community composer and had the influence that had on you. Plain song you've already mentioned, but there's also this sense of northernness, shall we say, in both of your works and the sense of landscape and place and so forth. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yes, the sense of place was obviously very important to Max. And when he started talking about the importance of place and making it clear that place and nature were important to him, certain scales fell from my eyes, because there was a particular kind of avant-gardist mindset, some might say propaganda, through the 60s and 70s, which saw nature and therefore place and landscape as being old-fashioned, something that modern composers shouldn't be doing anymore, something associated with the 19th century and Romanticism. And perhaps a lot of us fell into that. The idea that to be truly modern, one had to put these old-fashioned ideas aside. But Max was a clear indication that this might be fallacious, and that the idea of place and indeed nature, the love of nature, the representation of landscape and place and creation, as it were, the world could indeed still find its place, its natural and rightful place in a piece of modern music in the late 20th century and early 21st century. And that, as I say, that was a kind of revelation moment, I think, for many of us, including myself, who might have fallen into line as a younger composer, that some of the more militant ideas of the avant-garde imposed a restriction of possibilities on some of us. And Max certainly was never a party follower in that sense. He always, he was a great avant-gardist, a great modernist figure, but he was always temperamentally outside of the Darmstadt mainstream. He always had, some of the things he would say on these Hoy courses could be quite disparaging about the whole mindset of Darmstadt, the way it had developed. I know it's different now, but there was a kind of groupthink mentality, lockstep thinking going on amongst a lot of composers that Max would always be resistant to. And one of the most powerful resistances was this importance of place, and the way that he would, well, I mentioned Hoy already, and the way that he would see things around about him in nature, fish coming to the surface of the sea, an eagle landing next to him in his garden, wind, sea, sunrises. These things all found their way into his music, and didn't make him reactionary to do that. In many ways, he was just being natural to the cause of music making.
Yes, and some of these ideas that you just mentioned there, that's important to your music too, isn't it?
I would say so, yes. Maybe I perhaps don't make overt reference to them in program notes and things, but I'm certainly affected by where I am and where I work and what I see. I moved out to the back of beyond here in North Ayrshire about 7 years ago, and I find it very, very conducive to work. There's nothing wrong with being a composer in a big city, and many composers are like that, and they find their own space to do it. And I certainly did it for a couple of decades, and there was a lot of noise in a big city like Glasgow, but you have to carve out your own space. But I eventually got to a time, and maybe for Max, it was his move to Orkney that was his time to move out of noisy places and go to the countryside. And yet again, Maxwell Davies's influence played out in me as well. In that I moved to a very, very quiet place. I live on top of a hill. I can see the sea from my study. I can see islands like Arran and Cumbria. I can see a little bit of the Firth of Clyde, because we're 3 miles inland but up on a hill. No neighbours apart from sheep and some roe deer. Who does that remind you of? And I've established my festival not too far from here, the Cumnock Tryst.
Sounds idyllic. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your compositional process. I mean, do you like Max? Max made lots of sketches for his pieces, which are now housed in the British Library. I mean, do you have a similar type of process, or do you commit things straight to the paper?
A bit of both. I do have lots of sketches, but I'd be loath for anyone to see them. And the idea of giving my sketches to any library just fills me with horror. Actually, I don't want anyone to see what I've been up to. I don't know what. I think that's a major difference between Max and I. Maybe he did want to see. I mean, I've seen some of his sketches, and they're very, very impressive, and they're vital for research. Students get a lot out of studying. I do think they've got a lot out of studying mine.
I think you'll be surprised.
Yeah. Well, I do make sketches and diagrams, and I've certainly in the early days would the idea of making some sort of diagram on an A4 sheet, which was some kind of representation of the likelihood of an entire piece. That was important to me. And I think I got that from Max as well, the ability to, or the instinct to try to stand back from what one's doing is important, and sketching is important in that process. And if you can make a sketch of one likelihood of your piece, it can change, of course, and it should change. It nevertheless gives you some distance from the immediacy of being caught up in the here and now of the material. And sometimes being caught up in the here and now of material is a difficult place to be for a composer, because you can get sidelined or obsessed by certain things. And if one is not allowed, if one doesn't allow oneself to see a bigger picture, that sort of objective distance that I was talking about, you can ruin the structure of a piece. You can allow the ideas to be obsessively flabby and uncontrolled. Whereas if you have that then sense of distance, you start seeing things in perspective. You maybe start knocking things into shape. You get the perspectives right. You get the structure right. Structure is all important. Impose a structure that allows the ideas to live to their best advantage. Give your ideas a backbone. I suppose that's what structural planning and indeed sketching can be about.
Thank you very much for that answer. Back to you, Richard.
Well, I think at this point, would it be nice if anybody has questions for James? Perhaps we could actually encourage people to do that now. This big silence, is it?
I think Sally's going to go for a question. I can sense a Sally question here.
Hello, James. Lovely to see you.
Hi there, Sally.
I think I wanted to go back to those early. Richard mentioned Max's difficulty sometimes and uncertainty, and I think a lot of it with him was hammering out his notational problems, and that's still an issue, I think, isn't it, for composers?
Well, it's such an inexact science, and sometimes you've just got to be inventive with the information you want to give to your players. Sometimes notation, as it stands, isn't enough. It's not complete enough. It's not wide enough in order to communicate your desires and ideas to a player. And that's where, I mean, I remember with Max's pieces, sometimes he would just write words down and play the top of your range and so on. A lot of these kind of things came about in Davies' music, as well as things being very, very meticulously planned too. And you can see the influence of his studies of early music, those early pre-Renaissance scores that were important to both Max and Burt Whistle and others. But yes, it's an inexact notation, and it's an inexact science, as I say. And I think the more flexible can be with notation, the better. And maybe in the early days, the players didn't appreciate that. They wanted to be told exactly what they wanted according to traditional design, according to traditional notational format. But we've come a long way. And I think players, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned decades ago, orchestral players giving Max a hard time. I think a lot of players got that in the 60s and 70s. Sorry, a lot of composers got that. I've seen near riots at rehearsals with some composers, and you don't really see that anymore. Well, not in this country anyway. And so maybe the playing community have evolved in their maturity and experience of playing music by experimentalists like Max and others.
Just on the compositional thing, Max was, when he went to Petrassi, I think if I remember correctly, Petrassi sort of got Max to justify everything that he was writing. When he was working, when you saw him working with the younger composers, was he about getting them to do that, or had he had a slightly different way from what he'd got from Petrassi? Was he more sort of flexible than trying to say, well, you know, why did you do this and so on?
To an extent, he was very empathetic with younger composers and facilitated their engagement with players. And sometimes it was less to do with notation and technique, but more to do with psychology, group psychology, how to handle a group of potentially truculent musicians who might not be completely on side immediately. And Max certainly had to deal with that in his young days. I saw a little bit of that at the Hoy course. I mean, the composers were very young, and some were more open to that kind of help than others. Some were not open to help at all. I remember one in particular, I can't remember who it was. I think it was either a Chinese or a Korean composer who was asking the players, SCO players, late 1980s, you can just imagine who they were. Some of them are still around, some of them are very fine people indeed, but quite difficult, forthright characters. And this young composer was asking them to do strange things, not necessarily with their instruments, and more to do with their voices and growling and all this sort of thing. And eventually it led to a real crying match. One of the players found it so stressful that she fled the rehearsal room. And there was a terrible kind of scenario, terrible scene where Max had to intervene and in a sense take the composer to one side and explain to him what he had done wrong, that you can't do this, you've got to be aware of the sensitivities of players. But it was interesting, it was straying into the whole business of, what's the word that they use? Extended technique. Maybe making growling noises with your voice is an extended technique of one bassoon playing. One might say it's also an utter waste of time and a complete waste of musicians' time to be subjected to that. So Max was going into that territory, which was still alive and well as a discussion point amongst musicians, and still is today. I find that extended technique is discussed, but and then of course there's the whole issue of what is music and technique, ideas from the visual arts about concepts, conceptualism, finding its place in contemporary music, which is outside the parameters of traditional playing. I think although Max was very, very open-minded, when it came to certain things, he was quite strict, and he had to put his foot down on that issue. And eventually, the very next day, that young composer left the course without saying goodbye to any of us. It must have been a mortifying or difficult experience for him, and he left. I have never heard of him since, to be honest. Yeah, I've seen difficult situations involving players, Max, and young composers, And I think he always, well, in my experience, he handled them well. I don't know what he was like as a younger composer.
Have you anybody else with a question?
If not, can I ask another one, Richard?
Yeah, good. Okay.
James, we haven't really touched upon your choral pieces, your choral works. I'm just wondering to what extent Max's own choral pieces had an effect on you.
Yes. Well, he didn't write a lot for small choir, unaccompanied choir, although I think the Lullaby for Lucy appeared more or less at the time of the late 80s, when I was going to Hoy for the first time. In fact, Lucy would have been a baby in the late 80s, I suppose. And I remember it being taken up with great enthusiasm by lots of choirs. And perhaps there were some earlier pieces that were a bit more austere and difficult, and maybe are not performed as much. I kind of lost touch about what his early choral music was all about. But certainly, the pieces, those kind of pieces that were eventually performed and recorded by the youngsters at St Mary's Music School in Edinburgh, these were important for me in the way that he played about with traditions and was nevertheless made his choral music interesting and new at the same time. And that was a lesson as well. There's something about the human voice which requires a contextualization, and maybe Max came to that conclusion through these little pieces. And it's something I've been grappling with and thinking about all my life, about what makes a good piece of choral music, and what tonalities and intervals and vertical constructions work well for choir, what allows the human voice to root itself in something natural. I'm sure these are important considerations that composers are finding anew at this stage in history.
Yes, thank you. Are there any questions from anybody? Very polite today. Richard, you're on mute, I think. Yeah.
You're quite right. I was talking to the dog. I didn't think you all wanted to hear. So, James, it's been really good to have your perspectives on the work with Max and some understanding about how Max treated these various situations and how the some of the musical material was developed, or what informed his thinking, such as the lectures which he gave, which were clearly things that we knew about Gregorian chant, but late Beethoven was another key influence on him. It's the articulation of how that came up, what that led into his music, things like, which is, I think, is important to understand too.
Could I just add one postscript, actually, just this idea of the choral music and also chant and liturgy and so on. The quite astonishing thing, to some people's minds anyway, is that Westminster Cathedral actually commissioned a mass from Max round about, it was the late 1990s or early 2000s. I think it was recorded, but the idea, Max was no friend of the Catholic Church. I've got the wounds to prove that. He could be quite forthright in what he said. But the fact that he would write for the Westminster Cathedral and wrote very, very well for them, and the music people there loved the music. I think it's quite difficult, and they probably don't use it a lot. But I think that work is worth revisiting. And the fact that it was probably the culmination of a lot of Max's thoughts about chant, about liturgy, about the choir, and indeed about religion. And the fact that someone who was could be so aggressive about these matters, nevertheless found his way to be able to write this very beautiful, very challenging piece of Catholic liturgical music.
He actually commented on that at one point, that he asked them, I think, why they'd asked him. And they said, well, you know, we asked Vaughan Williams and he was an atheist. So, you know, so it was and they named another couple of composers that they'd commissioned. So it was, I think he understood that they were trying to build a repertoire of work, important work, not just because it was, you know, for the Catholic Church or whatever.
Yeah.
Nick,
I think there was a question from Tom. He put his hand up, and then I'm not sure if you wanted to ask that, Tom.
Yes, sorry. Thank you very much for this talk. I just wanted to ask James whether at any point Max's kind of aura as a composer, out of everyone I've ever met, he had this incredible aura and presence about him, and whether that was at any point in your life as a composer, or when you were assisting him in these projects, you ever felt a kind of need in some way to rebel against that. He could often feel like a father figure, and one sometimes needs to rebel. And I wondered whether you'd ever had that experience, or whether you were a bit further on in your creative journey by the time you worked with him.
Well, he was certainly a very intense presence, sometimes quite unnervingly intense. I've had some conversations with musicians who, although they greatly admired him, just found being in his presence with those staring eyes sometimes, searching eyes, quite an unnerving experience. And I know exactly what those comments point to. I felt that. I felt it slightly unnerved sometimes. It's partly because of being in the presence of a great man and someone who I admired from, as we were saying earlier, from quite early on in life. You never really go over that, no matter who it is, whether it's a musician or an artist or a political figure. To be in the presence of someone who is renowned and admired internationally and widely, you can never quite relax, to be honest. And I never really relaxed with Max, I must admit. I was always slightly on edge because he was so intense, but also very, very intelligent. He never made me feel what's the word? He never made me feel sort of uneasy about anything. It was never that kind of thing, but it was just the sheer intellectual heft that he had that would put people on edge sometimes. That was one of the things I always admired about him, and he brought that intellectual heft to the way that he presented music, not just in the writing of music, but the performance of music, and also the building of the festival in St Magnus. It wouldn't have worked in the same way if his intellect had not been as so acute. And that's something that I thought, you know, if I have to follow Max in any way at all, I need to remember that and to bring everything that is in a musician's personality to the table. If one is a natural teacher, bring that to the world of music. If one is a natural academic who explores and researches, bring that to the world of composition too. I don't think I rebelled, no. Maybe if I had known him more personally, there might have been issues. I know that there were people who were very intensely friendly with him, but fell away. I don't think I ever allowed myself into that position. And I still have a great, not just admiration, but affection for him. I mean, even just talking about this I find quite moving, just remembering everything and just how important it all was for me. And for that reason, you know, we musicians owe his memory something, and we've got to keep his legacy alive. And I know that there are sometimes cycles in composers, in the perception of the public to composers. And, you know, after Tippett died, for example, there was a lull in the interest in his music, but cyclically that interest is coming back. And maybe Max's music, maybe it's not being performed as much as it should just now, but the cycle will turn. and we've got to be ready to step up with advocacy for Maxwell Davies's music. It might just be around the corner, who knows.
It's interesting, James, that you concluded with a kind of personal reflection on the importance of Max, which is exactly what Sally and Gillian did at the end of our sessions with them. The importance to them, sort of almost emotionally in one kind of a way. Yeah. So, I mean, we're very grateful to you for sharing your experience of that. And thank you so much, Nick.
Very welcome. Thanks for joining me, everybody. And I've been very pleased and delighted that you asked me to be involved in the project. And good luck with the next steps that you have with the network.
Thank you so much, James. Yes, I mean you have a very, very busy schedule, I'm sure. So I'm really, really thankful for you sharing your thoughts on Max and your memories of Max. So thank you very much indeed.
Very welcome.
Nick, do you want to just flag the next one?
Yes, our next forum, I've got it here. Our next Friday forum will take place on the 23rd of June. And our next speaker will be the clarinetist Dmitry Ashkenazi. And Dmitry will be sharing his memories of Max, but we'll be talking about the Strathclyde Concerto No. 4.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, everybody, and thanks again, James. Wonderful talk.
All the best to you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.